On the edge of a busy city, there was an old cemetery that most people avoided. It wasn't exactly spooky, but it had this quiet, forgotten vibe to it. The grass grew wild. Tombstones tilted slightly as if tired from standing for so long, and the air carried a heaviness you couldn't quite explain. Most locals only passed by on their way somewhere else, glancing at it briefly before looking away. But one day, a man named Thomas decided to wander inside. Thomas wasn't someone who usually paid attention to cemeteries. He worked in a nearby shop and spent his days helping customers find things they didn't really need. That afternoon, though, something pulled him toward the cemetery gates. Maybe it was boredom, maybe curiosity, or maybe it was fate nudging him along. Whatever it was, he stepped through the iron bars and began walking down the narrow paths between graves. As he strolled deeper into the cemetery, Thomas noticed a figure sitting near one particular grave. At first glance, the person looked like any other homeless man. Dirty clothes, unkempt hair, a scruffy beard. But there was something different about him. Instead of staring blankly into space or begging passers-by for money, this man sat perfectly, still, his eyes fixed on the headstone in front of him. There was no anger or frustration in his expression, just pure sadness, the kind that runs deep and doesn't fade easily. Thomas slowed his pace, unsure whether to approach or leave the man alone. Curiosity won out. Quietly, he walked closer, until he stood a few feet away. Clearing his throat gently, he asked, "Excuse me, is everything okay?" The man didn't respond right away. For a moment, Thomas thought he hadn't heard him. Then, without turning around, the stranger replied in a low, gravelly voice, "No, son, everything ain't okay." His words hung heavy in the air, making Thomas hesitate. He shifted awkwardly, unsure what to say next. Finally, he nodded toward the grave and asked softly, "Who's buried here?" This time the man turned to look at him. His face was lined with age and hardship, his eyes clouded with memories too painful to let go of. After a long pause, he answered, "My wife." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected such a raw answer. Wanting to lighten the mood, he tried again, asking, "Do you come here often?" The man chuckled dryly, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Every damn day," he said. "Been coming here for years now, don't have much else to do." Something about the way he spoke made Thomas stay longer than he intended. He crouched down beside the man, careful not to intrude, but close enough to show he cared. "I'm sorry for your loss," he murmured sincerely. The man shrugged, as if apologies didn't mean much anymore. Still, he seemed grateful for the company. Pulling a crumpled photograph from his pocket, he handed it to Thomas. In the picture, a younger version of the man stood next to a smiling woman. They were holding hands, their faces glowing with happiness. "That's her," the man said simply. "She was my whole world." Looking at the photo, Thomas could see why. The woman radiated warmth and kindness, the kind that drew people in and made them feel welcome. Even frozen in time, she seemed alive somehow, full of energy and love. Thomas handed the picture back carefully, feeling like he'd been entrusted with something precious. "You must have loved her a lot," Thomas said after a while. The man nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the grave. "More than anything," he admitted. "But love, well, it doesn't always save you, does it?" His words struck a chord with Thomas, leaving him speechless. He wanted to ask more questions about how they met, what happened, why the man ended up living on the streets. But he didn't want to pry. Some stories are meant to unfold naturally, not be forced out of someone. For the next half hour they sat together in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When Thomas finally stood up to leave, he glanced back at the man one last time. Something told him this wasn't the end of their encounter, that there was more to learn, more to understand. Little did he know, this chance meeting would lead him down a path filled with heartache, resilience, and ultimately hope. And so, the story of the beggar at his wife's grave began, not with grand gestures or dramatic twists, but with a simple, act of human connection. To understand how the man ended up sitting by his wife's grave every day, we need to go back in time. Decades ago, long before he became the shadow of a person Thomas met at the cemetery, he was just another struggling soul trying to make ends meet. Life wasn't easy for him back then. He worked odd jobs, sometimes cleaning streets, other times helping out at construction sites. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept food on the table and a roof over his head. What kept him going during those tough days was a woman who believed in him when no one else did. She wasn't flashy or loud. She was quiet, kind, and had a laugh that could light up even the darkest room. They weren't rich, but they didn't care. Their evenings were spent sharing simple meals under flickering bulbs, talking about dreams bigger than their tiny rented apartment. He often joked that if love could pay bills, they'd be millionaires. But deep down, he knew their bond was worth more than any amount of money. One evening, as he walked home from a long day of hauling crates at the market, something caught his eye on the ground. A wallet. At first glance, it looked ordinary, worn leather with a few scratches. But when he opened it, his breath hitched. Inside was exactly $100. To most people, that might not seem like much, but to him, it felt like winning the lottery. For weeks, he'd been worrying about how to scrape together enough cash to fix the leaky roof in their apartment. Now, here, was an answer dropped right into his hands. He didn't celebrate immediately, though. Instead, he sat on the curb, staring at the wallet, torn between excitement and guilt. The money could solve so many problems, but it wasn't his. What if someone desperately needed it? After wrestling with his conscience for what felt like hours, he finally decided to take it home and discuss it with her. When he showed her the wallet, she listened quietly, her brow furrowed in thought. "This isn't ours," she said firmly, after a moment. "But maybe we can use it for good." "What do you mean?" he asked, confused. She smiled softly, her eyes lighting up with an idea. "Let's start small. Use it to build something. Not just for us, but for others too. Something that'll bring people together." Her words sparked something inside him. Together they came up with a plan, a roadside food stall. It wouldn't cost much to set up, just enough to buy ingredients, pots, pans, and a foldable table. She would handle the cooking since she had a knack for whipping up delicious meals, while he'd manage everything else. It was risky, sure, but they figured they had nothing to lose. The next morning, they pooled the $100 with whatever little savings they had and got to work. By sunset, their modest stall stood proudly on a busy street corner, its wooden sign painted, with shaky letters that read, "Best Meals in Town." They laughed nervously as they prepared for their first customers, unsure if anyone would stop. But within minutes, curious passers-by started gathering, lured by the smell of freshly cooked food wafting through the air. Word spread quickly. People loved not only the taste of the food, but also the warmth and care that went into every dish. Before long, lines formed daily, and their little stall became a local favorite. Strangers turned into regulars, and soon everyone knew their names. Success wasn't instant. It took months of hard work, sleepless nights, and countless sacrifices. But slowly things began to change. With the profits from the stall, they saved enough to rent a bigger space and turn it into a proper restaurant. It was a dream come true, something neither of them ever imagined possible. Customers filled the place nightly, praising the cozy atmosphere and mouth-watering dishes. Life seemed perfect, or as close to perfect as it could get. But success came with challenges. Running a business meant longer hours away from home. While she stayed behind to manage the kitchen, he spent his days handling deliveries, meeting suppliers, and dealing with paperwork. The weight of responsibility grew heavier with each passing month. Though she never complained, he could sense her growing loneliness. Late-night conversations dwindled, replaced by exhausted silences. Still, he convinced himself it was temporary. All this hard work, he told himself, was for their future, for a life where they wouldn't have to worry about anything ever again. Looking back, he realized now how wrong he'd been. Success hadn't brought them closer. It had driven a wedge between them. And just when they thought they were building a foundation strong enough to last forever, Fate stepped in to remind them how fragile life truly is. As the restaurant grew busier, life became a whirlwind of activity. The man threw himself into work, chasing success like it was the only thing that mattered. He told himself he was doing it for her, for their future together. But somewhere, along the way, he lost sight of what really mattered. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The couple who once laughed over simple meals now barely saw each other. She tried to stay strong, keeping the kitchen running smoothly while he handled the business side of things. Her smile never faltered in front of customers, but behind closed doors, she often sat alone at the table they used to share, staring at empty chairs. She missed him, not just his presence, but the way he used to look at her, as if she were the only person in the world. Now his eyes were always tired, his mind consumed by numbers, deadlines, and endless to-do lists. One evening, after closing time, she finally spoke up. "Do you remember why we started this?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the bustling dining area. He paused, wiping his hands on a towel. "Of course I do," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's our dream." She shook her head gently, her expression tinged with sadness. "No, it's not. Our dream was to have a better life, to be happy together. This," she waved her hand around the room, "this is just a building. It doesn't mean anything if we're losing ourselves in the process." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he brushed them aside. "We've worked too hard to stop now," he said firmly. "Just a little longer, okay? Once we're stable, I promise I'll slow down." But promises are easy to make and harder to keep. Life had its own plans, and they weren't kind. A few months later, everything changed. She fell ill suddenly. So suddenly that neither of them saw it coming. At first they thought it was just exhaustion from working long hours. But when the fatigue didn't go away and strange symptoms began to appear, they visited a doctor. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap, a rare condition that required immediate, expensive treatment. The news shattered them both. For the first time in years, he dropped everything and focused solely on her. They sold the restaurant, their car, even their home, pouring every penny into her medical care. Friends and family pitched in where they could, but the costs kept piling up. Despite their best efforts, nothing seemed to help. Every day felt like a battle, and every night brought fresh waves of fear and despair. Through it all, she remained brave, clinging to hope even when it felt pointless. "Don't give up," she whispered to him one evening as they sat side by side in the hospital. "Promise me you won't give up." "I won't," he vowed, gripping her hand tightly. "I'll do whatever it takes." But fate is cruel sometimes. No matter how much love or determination you pour into something, there are battles you can't win. After months of fighting, she slipped away quietly, leaving him utterly broken. The world felt hollow without her, like someone had turned off the lights and left him stumbling in the dark. In the days that followed, grief swallowed him whole. He couldn't bring himself to face the empty house they'd shared or the memories that lingered in every corner. Friends reached out offering support, but he pushed them away. He blamed himself for not being able to save her, for letting work come between them when she needed him most. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, a constant reminder of everything he'd lost. With no direction left in life, he walked away from everything. He sold the last of their belongings, gave away what little money remained, and disappeared from society. People assumed he vanished because he couldn't handle the financial ruin. But the truth was far deeper. Without her, nothing else mattered. For months he wandered aimlessly, surviving on scraps and the kindness of strangers. Each night he returned to the cemetery where she was buried, sitting beside her grave until dawn. It became his routine, his anchor in a world that felt meaningless. He talked to her as if she were still alive, recounting stories from their past, apologizing for his mistakes, and promising to honor her memory. Strangely, sitting there gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt since before her illness. The cemetery wasn't just a place of mourning. It was a sanctuary, a space where he could feel close to her again. Visitors passing by noticed the man who spent his nights by the same grave, his weathered face etched with sorrow. Some pitied him. Others admired his devotion. Few understood the depth of his pain or the weight of the love he carried. Years passed, and the man became a fixture in the neighborhood. Locals began to recognize him, leaving coins or food near the gate for him to find. Children playing tag among the tombstones would wave at him, giggling as they ran past. Neighbors whispered about the beggar at his wife's grave, speculating about his story. But none of them truly knew the man behind the tattered clothes, the man who had once built a thriving business, loved deeply, and lost everything, and yet despite the hardships, something inside him refused to break completely. Sitting by her grave each night, he clung to the memories of their life together, the laughter, the struggles, the dreams they'd shared. Those memories weren't enough to erase the pain, but they kept him going one day at a time. Every evening, without fail, the man returned to the cemetery. It became his routine, as natural to him as breathing. The walk from wherever he had spent his day, whether it was a park bench, an alleyway, or under a bridge, to the quiet rows of tombstones felt like coming home. To most people, the cemetery was just a place where the dead rested, filled with silence and sadness. But for him, it was alive with memories. Every step he took through the overgrown grass brought him closer to her, to the woman who had been his entire world. He would sit cross-legged near her grave, sometimes for hours, talking softly as if she were sitting right beside him. He told her about his day, describing the faces he saw on the streets, the weather, or how the city seemed to change bit by bit every year. Other times he'd simply sit in silence, tracing the engraved letters on her headstone with trembling fingers. There were days when tears streamed down his face, unchecked and raw, blurring the words he whispered. And then there were moments when a faint smile crept onto his lips, a fleeting reminder of happier times. People noticed him, of course. How could they not? He wasn't like the others who visited graves only on special occasions, leaving flowers, or lighting candles before heading back to their busy lives. This man lived at the cemetery in a way. His presence lingered long after sunset, even when the air turned cold and the stars blinked awake in the sky. Some passers-by pitied him, shaking their heads at the sight of his worn-out clothes and hollow cheeks. Others admired his loyalty, wondering what kind of love could keep someone tethered to a grave for so many years. Among those who noticed him was Thomas, the same man who had first approached him months earlier. At first, Thomas didn't think much of it. He assumed the beggar was just another lonely soul searching for solace. But over time, curiosity got the better of him. He started visiting the cemetery more often, always finding the man in the same spot, rain or shine. One chilly evening, armed with a thermos of hot tea, Thomas decided to sit beside him. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas asked gently, holding out the thermos. The man glanced up, surprised, but not unwelcoming. "Suit yourself," he muttered, shifting slightly to make room. Thomas poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to the man. For a while, neither of them spoke. They sat together in companionable silence, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Finally, Thomas broke the quiet. "You come here every night, don't you?" The man nodded, cradling the warm cup in his hands. "Yeah, been doing it for years now." "Why?" Thomas asked, his tone curious but respectful. "If you don't mind me asking." The question hung in the air for a moment. The man stared into his tea as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with emotion. "Because I messed up," he admitted. "I let her down when she needed me most. Now all I've got left is this chance to talk to her even if she can't answer." Thomas frowned, unsure what to say. He waited patiently, sensing that the man wasn't done. "I built a life for us," the man continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "A good life, or so I thought. We had a restaurant, customers lining up, money in the bank. People looked at us and said, "Wow, they made it." But making it meant nothing if we weren't happy, and I didn't realize that until it was too late. His voice cracked, and he paused to take a shaky sip of tea. Thomas stayed silent, letting him gather his thoughts. She got sick. The man went on, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Really sick. Doctors said it was rare, something they couldn't fix easily. So we sold everything. The restaurant, our house, the car. Every penny went into her treatment, but no matter what we did, it wasn't enough. She slipped away, and I couldn't save her. He bowed his head, his shoulders trembling as grief washed over him. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to offer comfort, to tell the man that it wasn't his fault, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. Instead, he placed a hand on the man's shoulder, offering silent support. After a few minutes, the man wiped his eyes and straightened up. "I should have been there for her," he said bitterly. "Instead, I was chasing stupid dreams, working myself to the bone, thinking I was doing the right thing. By the time I realized what really mattered, it was already too." Over the next few weeks, Thomas became a regular visitor at the cemetery. At first, the man wasn't sure what to make of it. He didn't trust easily, not anymore, and he wondered why this stranger kept coming back. Was Thomas just curious? Did he feel sorry for him? Or was there something else driving him to sit beside a broken man night after night? Whatever the reason, the man couldn't deny that Thomas's presence was comforting. There was no judgment in his eyes, no awkward pity or forced attempts to fix things. Instead, Thomas simply listened, really listened, as the man poured out pieces of his story. Bit by bit, the fragments of his past began to take shape, like shards of glass being pieced together into a stained glass window. One evening, as they sat under a tree near her grave, Thomas asked, "Do you ever think about going back to the places you used to go when she was alive?" The man frowned, taken aback by the question. "Go back?" he echoed. "Why would I do that? Those places are gone now. The restaurant, the house, all of it's changed." "Not everything changes," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Some things stay the same, even if you don't see them anymore. Maybe revisiting those spots could help you remember the good times instead of just the bad ones." The idea struck a nerve. For years, the man had avoided anything that reminded him of their life together. Every corner of the city seemed to whisper her name. The park where they'd taken lazy Sunday strolls, the market where they'd haggled over fresh produce, the tiny apartment where they'd dreamed of brighter days. Going back felt like reopening old wounds, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of pain. But Thomas wasn't giving up so easily. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently. "Just think about it. Sometimes facing the hard stuff helps us heal more than we expect." The man didn't respond. He stared at the ground, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to cling to the safety of routine, to keep showing up at the cemetery every night and pretending the rest of the world didn't exist. But another part of him, a small, fragile part, wondered if Thomas might be right. What if revisiting the past wasn't about reliving the pain? What if it was about reclaiming the joy he'd lost along the way? A few days later, the man found himself standing outside a cafe. It wasn't just any cafe, it was the site of their old restaurant, the place where everything had started. His heart pounded as he pushed open the door, half expecting to hear the clatter of dishes and the hum of happy customers. But the space inside was completely different now. Bright lights replaced the warm glow of lanterns. Sleek furniture stood where mismatched tables and chairs used to be, and the smell of coffee overpowered the memory of sizzling spices. Still, as he walked around, flashes of the past came rushing back. He remembered the late nights spent scrubbing floors until his hands were raw, the early mornings when she'd hand him a steaming cup of tea before they opened for the day, the laughter that filled the room whenever someone complimented her cooking. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the modern decor and pulling him back to a time when life felt full of promise. The barista behind the counter noticed him lingering and approached cautiously. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked. He nodded, though his voice trembled when he spoke. "This used to be my restaurant," he admitted. "Years ago." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Wow, really? That must have been amazing." "It was," he replied softly. Then after a pause, he added, "And it was hard, but it was worth it." As he left the cafe, the weight on his chest felt slightly lighter. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel pride, not for the money they'd made or the success they'd achieved, but for the effort they'd put into building something together. They hadn't done it perfectly, but they'd done it with love. And maybe that was enough. Encouraged by the experience, Thomas suggested they visit other places from the man's past. One afternoon, they wandered through the market where he and his wife had shopped for ingredients. The man pointed out stalls they used to frequent, sharing stories about bargaining with vendors and experimenting with new recipes. A fruit seller recognized him and smiled warmly, recalling how his wife's smile could light up the entire marketplace. Another day they stopped by the park where they'd spent countless weekends. Children played on swings while couples strolled, hand in hand, oblivious to the history embedded in the soil beneath their feet. Sitting on a bench, the man closed his eyes and imagined her sitting beside him, her laughter mingling with the sound of rustling leaves. Each visit stirred a mix of emotions, pain, nostalgia, gratitude, but also a growing sense of clarity. The man realized that his memories weren't just anchors weighing him down. They were lifelines connecting him to the woman he loved. She hadn't disappeared entirely. Pieces of her lived on in the stories he told, the lessons he'd learned, and the love that still lingered in his heart. Back at the cemetery one evening, the man pulled out a crumpled notebook he'd started carrying with him. Inspired by Thomas's encouragement, he began writing letters to her. At first, the words came slowly, hesitant and fragmented. But as he wrote, the floodgates opened. He poured out apologies, regrets, and promises he wished he'd made while she was alive. He thanked her for teaching him how to dream, for believing in him when no one else did, and for loving him despite his flaws. Writing became a form of release, a way to untangle the knot of emotions that had been strangling him for years. With each letter, he felt a little freer, a little lighter. It wasn't easy. Some nights the tears flowed so heavily that the ink smudged on the page, but it was necessary. He owed it to her to face the truth, to acknowledge both the beauty and the mistakes of their shared life. Thomas watched silently as the man transformed, not overnight, but gradually. The bitterness softened, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The anger faded, leaving behind a deep, aching love that refused to die. Though the man still visited the cemetery every night, his visits grew less desperate, less consumed by grief. Instead of clinging to her memory, he began carrying it with him, letting it guide him forward rather than hold him back. And in those quiet moments, surrounded by tombstones and stars, the man found something he hadn't expected: hope. Not the kind of hope that erases pain or pretends everything is fine, but the kind that whispers, "You'll be okay." As the weeks turned into months, the man began to notice subtle changes in himself. The sharp edges of his grief were slowly softening, worn down by the steady rhythm of reflection and writing. Each letter he penned to her felt like a step forward, however small. He wasn't trying to erase the pain or rewrite the past. He knew that was impossible, but he was learning how to live with it. And for the first time in years, he started to feel like maybe, just maybe, life didn't have to end when hers did. Thomas noticed the shift too. The man's posture seemed less slumped. His voice carried a hint of warmth instead of constant sorrow. And there were even moments when he laughed, real, genuine laughter, at memories they shared during their visits to old haunts. It wasn't loud or frequent, but it was enough to make Thomas smile. This wasn't the same broken man he'd met months ago, sitting alone by a grave with nothing but regret in his eyes. Something had shifted, and though the journey was far from over, progress was undeniable. One evening, as they sat together under the sprawling branches of an ancient tree near the cemetery, Thomas broached a topic that had been on his mind for a while. "You've got so much wisdom," he said carefully, glancing at the man. stories that could help others who are going through similar things. Have you ever thought about sharing them? The man raised an eyebrow, surprised by the suggestion. Sharing? With who? I'm nobody special, just a guy who made mistakes and lost everything. That's exactly why people need to hear your story, Thomas countered. Not everyone has gone through what you have, but everyone knows loss in some form. Grief, guilt, regret. They're universal. If you can find a way to talk about it, maybe you could give someone else hope when they feel like there's none left. The idea unsettled him. Opening up to Thomas had been one thing. The man trusted him now, saw him as a friend. But talking to strangers, letting them into the raw, messy parts of his life, that felt like stepping into uncharted territory, exposing wounds he wasn't sure had fully healed. I don't know, he muttered, shaking his head. It's not easy putting yourself out there like that. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the difficulty. You're right, it's not easy. But neither is sitting here every night carrying all this weight by yourself. Maybe sharing your story would lighten the load a little. And hey, you never know who might need to hear it. The man didn't respond immediately. He stared off into the distance, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For years he'd kept his pain locked away, hidden behind tattered clothes and weary eyes. Sharing it felt like inviting the world to see his scars, to judge him for the choices he'd made and the life he'd led. But deep down, he also knew that keeping it bottled up hadn't done him any favors either. If anything, it had only made the burden heavier. A few days later, Thomas introduced the man to a local community center, where volunteers helped people navigate tough times, loss, addiction, homelessness, and more. At first, the man hesitated. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers terrified him. As the weeks went by, the man found himself looking forward to the community center meetings. At first, he'd only attended because Thomas had encouraged him, but now it felt like something more. A purpose, however small, that gave his days a sense of direction. Each time he shared a piece of his story, he noticed how it resonated with others. People nodded in understanding, their eyes reflecting the same pain and longing he carried inside. It wasn't easy. Talking about her still brought tears to his eyes, but there was comfort in knowing he wasn't alone. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt session, a young woman approached him. She couldn't have been older than 25, her face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. Her hands trembled as she held a crumpled tissue, and when she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion. I lost my mom last year, she admitted, her gaze fixed on the floor. And I feel like I'm drowning. No matter what I do, I can't shake this guilt, like I should have done more for her. The man listened quietly, remembering all too well the weight of those feelings. He gestured for her to sit beside him, offering a reassuring smile. You didn't fail her, he said gently. Guilt is part of grief. It tricks us into thinking we could have changed things, but love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when you don't know what to say or do. She looked at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. How did you learn to keep going? She asked softly. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Honestly, I'm still learning. Some days are better than others. But one thing that helps is remembering the good times, the laughter, the little moments that made life beautiful, and talking about it, letting yourself feel instead of bottling it all up. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as if a tiny bit of the burden had lifted. Before leaving, she thanked him, promising to come back to the next meeting. Watching her walk away, the man felt a flicker of pride, not for himself, but for the idea that maybe, just maybe, he was making a difference. Over time, the man became a regular fixture at the community center. The facilitators began asking him to lead smaller group discussions, sharing insights he'd gained through his own journey. He never pretended to have all the answers. Instead, he spoke honestly about his struggles, his mistakes, and the slow, messy process of healing. His vulnerability resonated with people, creating a safe space where others felt comfortable opening up too. But helping others didn't mean his own pain vanished. Late at night, When the world grew quiet and the cemetery welcomed him with open arms, he still wrestled with memories of her. Sitting by her grave, he'd talk to her as if she were sitting right beside him, recounting the stories he'd heard during the day and the connections he'd forged. Sometimes he'd laugh at the absurdity of it all, how someone who once felt so broken could now help mend other broken pieces. "You'd probably tease me for getting sentimental," he murmured one chilly evening, wrapping his thin jacket tighter around himself. "But I think you'd be proud. Not because I'm doing anything special, but because I'm finally trying." He paused, tilting his head toward the stars. "Do you remember how we used to dream about changing the world? About building something bigger than ourselves? Well, maybe this is it. Maybe helping one person at a time is enough." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. For a moment he imagined her voice whispering back, soft and warm, telling him he was doing just fine. Thomas watched the transformation unfold with quiet admiration. The man who had once pushed everyone away was now reaching out, forming bonds with strangers and finding strength in shared experiences. One afternoon, as they sat together on a park bench near the cemetery, Thomas couldn't help but comment on it. "You've come a long way," he said, glancing sideways at the man. "When I first met you, you barely spoke. Now look at you. Helping people, leading groups, even smiling occasionally." The man chuckled, scratching the stubble on his chin. "Smiling's overrated," he joked, though his tone was light. After a pause, he added, "I wouldn't have gotten here without you. You kept pushing me even when I wanted to give up." Thomas shook his head. "All I did was nudge you in the right direction. The hard work was yours. Besides, I think she'd want you to keep moving forward." The mention of her name sent a pang through the man's chest, but it wasn't sharp like before. It was softer now, tinged with gratitude rather than regret. "Yeah," he agreed softly. "She always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Maybe that's why I'm still here, to honor her memory by living the way she taught. Me too." As spring turned to summer, the cemetery began to feel less like a refuge and more like a bridge between two worlds. The man continued visiting every evening, but his visits grew lighter somehow. Instead of wallowing in despair, he brought flowers, arranging them neatly around her grave. On sunny days, he'd sit under a nearby tree, watching children play and couples stroll hand in hand. Occasionally, he'd strike up conversations with visitors, sharing snippets of her story and the lessons he'd learned along the way. People started recognizing him, waving hello or stopping to chat. Some brought snacks or blankets, insisting he'd take care of himself. Others simply offered kind words, reminding him that he wasn't invisible. Slowly, the isolation that had defined his life for so long began to fade, replaced by a fragile, yet undeniable sense of belonging. One evening, as he packed up his notebook and prepared to leave, a child tugged at his sleeve. She couldn't have been older than 6, her curly hair bouncing as she grinned up at him. "Are you the man who tells stories about love?" she asked innocently. He blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I guess I am," he replied, smiling despite himself. "My mommy says your stories make people happy," she announced proudly. Then, without waiting for a response, she skipped off to join her friends, leaving him speechless. Standing there, surrounded by tombstones and laughter, the man realized something profound. Love doesn't die when people do. It lingers, in memories, in actions, in the connections we forge with others. And though he missed her every single day, he knew she was still with him, guiding him forward in ways he'd never expected. For the first time in years, he left the cemetery with a genuine smile, ready to face whatever came next. The man's life didn't transform overnight. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was more like climbing a mountain with steep slopes and slippery paths. Some days he felt stronger, ready to face the world with a little more courage. Other days the weight of her absence hit him so hard that he could barely breathe. But even on those difficult days, something had shifted. He no longer ran from the pain. Instead, he carried it with him, letting it remind him of how deeply he had loved and been loved. At the community center, he became a steady presence. People, came to trust him, knowing they could sit beside him without fear of judgment or dismissal. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. In fact, he often admitted when he didn't know what to say, but his honesty made others feel seen and heard. One older woman who rarely spoke during sessions pulled him aside one evening after a meeting. Her hands shook as she gripped his arm tightly. "I haven't told anyone this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I lost my son last year. Every day feels like I'm drowning." The man listened quietly, his own heart aching at her words. "You're not alone in this," he said gently. "It doesn't get easier, not really, but you learn to carry it differently. And sometimes just talking about it helps, even if it hurts." She nodded, clutching a tissue in trembling fingers. "Thank you," she murmured. "Just hearing you say that, it makes me feel like maybe I can keep going." Moments like these became a kind of medicine for him. Helping others gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about fixing their problems. He knew grief couldn't be fixed. It was about sitting with them in the darkness, reminding them they weren't alone. In doing so, he began to realize that he wasn't alone either. Back at the cemetery, his visits took on a new rhythm. He still sat by her grave every evening, but the tone of his conversations changed. Instead of dwelling on regrets or replaying old memories over and over, he started sharing stories about the people he'd met at the community center. He told her about the young woman struggling to find hope after losing her mother, the older man who spoke about his late wife with equal parts laughter and tears, and the little girl who called him the story man. "I think you'd like them," he said one night, leaning back against the cool stone of her headstone. "They're fighting their battles just like we did. They remind me of us, how we kept going, even when things got tough." Sometimes he imagined her sitting beside him, nodding along or offering a witty comment that would make him chuckle. Other times, he simply sat in silence, letting the quiet wrap around him like a warm blanket. The cemetery, once a place of solitude and sorrow, now felt alive with connection, not just to her but to everyone whose lives had touched his. One crisp autumn morning, Thomas joined him at the cemetery. They walked together among the rows of graves, their breath visible in the chilly air. Thomas glanced at the man, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor. His steps were steadier, his shoulders less hunched. Though sadness still lingered in his eyes, it was softened by something else. Hope, perhaps, or acceptance. "You've do,"